Class is recording. Welcome back for everybody that's been watching, and for anybody that's new, hi, welcome. My name is Nano. We're going to be doing a class today on First Bloods. We're still going onto the fundamentals. We're still covering a lot of those basic concepts that people should know if they want to climb. And with First Bloods, we'll be talking about why they're so essential in a game. If you're someone that wants to rank up, if you're someone that knows that they're good enough at the game, but they can't really climb, this is something that might be for you. First Bloods are something that are pretty much an aspect of the game that people tend to ignore or they tend to do and they're not really aware. So if you're someone that likes to VOD review yourself or you like to look at games themselves, I think that this might be a good class for you to look at what exactly it is that will give you that advantage or that edge. Okay. So let's get started with a couple of the things that we're going to be looking at. Okay, we're going to be looking at its importance. We're going to be looking at the gains that you really get and subsequently those losses that you get when you lose a man or when you gain a man. We're going to be looking at stuff like that and then different methods. I can't really cover every single thing at once. Once we get into the advanced topics, we will definitely be talking about individual maps and individual strategies that you can use for yourself. That's something that we can do. There's plenty of videos out there if you want to do that right now. But for now, we're going to be covering those essentials that you should know. So for example, what happens when you're playing by yourself and you just want to do those solo plays on your own. Okay, things that you can do with your team if you want to onboard them onto a strat, and things that if you have reads on defender or attacker side. So let's get started. First things first, okay? Let's understand the concept of First Bloods. And by doing so, we need to understand numbers in a game. I want you guys to think of any game that you guys really like, whether it's Battleship, whether it's chess, checkers, any of the sort, any game that you really like, okay? And think of a time that you would pick, if you were evenly balanced, evenly matched, that you would pick to lose one of those characters, okay? So for example, I would pick chess, and I would never choose to lose that character. Sure, I can be like, oh, it's a test of skill, and just go all ego and be like, I'm just gonna win. No, I'd win, right? You can do that, but at the end of the day, why would you choose to be at a disadvantage? Okay, First Bloods in Valorant are a way to maintain pressure by gaining an elim, and this allows you to maintain a lead just purely from that perspective alone. Okay. If you guys don't really have any of those yourselves, then sure. I mean, if you have no other game that you play other than Valorant, maybe you have a harder time conceptualizing it. But let's just kind of break it down a little bit deeper than that. Okay. Looking into a man advantage. When you gain a man advantage, you have more guns in the field. That means more bullets onto another player. We have more vision. We have more space. More people are covering areas. More people are looking at different areas that can give you information. You have more utility, right? You have more trades, you have more chances to win a fight. And we're going to be looking at this example right here. This right here is, this is a game from the America qualifiers. Basically what it is we have Loud versus Sentinels. And what we're seeing right now is we're seeing basic teams right now. If any of these players were to have lost an elim, if any of these teams had lost a player, they would already be at a disadvantage, okay? If you were to look at this right now, 5v5, and you were to take a single player off of this field, these teams, regardless of who they lose, they need to have a strategy to play with that disadvantage in mind or with that advantage in mind. It is that powerful. So I were to ask you, if I were to ask you, who would you take out of this team right now? You know, who would you give that advantage? It basically just shows that, you know, you have a preference for that team. Same likewise, I would say, if you had the choice to have a man down in every single one of your ranked games, as opposed to having the enemy team have a man down in one of those ranked games, you would probably choose the opponent. Okay, so it's one of those things where we have to look at how powerful that is. Now let's look at those gains versus those losses. Okay, so let's see how we can work with that. So first of all, when we're looking at those advantages from the attacker side, whenever you get a first blood, you need to understand that they lose a lot of space. They lose a lot of control of the map. Okay, they have 5 players, and losing a single player on that map means that they have less control of the map and they have more space to worry about. Not to control, but to worry about. And that destabilizes whatever they have in terms of their stronghold and in terms of their defense, right? So when attackers get a first blood, they get an advantage of being able to get a site slightly easier. Now, of course, we can consider things like sentinels and how strong they are. We can consider solo holders. We can consider those that can 1v5. Sure, these are elements that exist in the game, but from a purely theoretical standpoint, from a purely just looking at the map as it is, most of the time, the majority of the time, destabilizing those defenses comes down to more pressure to the defenders. Likewise, if we look at the defender side, if they gain an advantage by getting a first pick, a first blood, they have less site pressure. There's less utility to worry about. There's less pressure potentially that they might use. So if I'm playing something, for example, like this jet, and I take the enemy jet out, that's entry that I don't have to worry about anymore, right? That's maybe a smokes player that I no longer have to worry about. So looking at the type of pressure that you get relieved or that you apply is something that you have to look at when you're getting that first blood. Okay. So this is a good point in time to ask, does anyone have any questions about the importance of first bloods? Does anyone here understand it? Does anyone here want to add on it? Any questions? No questions. Perfect. It seems like you guys got it. Let's talk a little bit about the 50-50. And before we move on, I need you guys to understand where most first bloods tend to happen in the 50-50. A 50-50 is just, it's a gamble whether you win or they win. Okay? You swing, they might get a lucky shot and they hit you, or you get the swing, no utility, no nothing, just take the fight. You know, whoever wins, it's a 50-50. Okay? Basically, two opponents are battling it out, and they're just, whoever has the better gunplay wins. When we're looking at that, most of the time in solo play, when you're playing alone, when you're playing away from your team, or when you're just playing in a default and no one else is helping you, it is just a 50-50. Okay? Most of these fights tend to happen in these areas that I like to call the first point of contact. Generally happens in the biggest hotspots in entrances. Maybe the example right here could be like the entrance to B main on Ascent. It could be the entrance to A main on Ascent. It could be the entrance to any of the mains. Okay? These are the examples of where the first point of contact will occur. Okay? The second that these walls are down, if both players press W on their key, they're going to encounter themselves in these positions. This is what a first point of contact will be, and this is where most of these fights take place. Okay? When you're playing in a 50-50, you have to consider those first points of contact because you have to be aware of where the enemy is going to be. When you're using this and when you're playing solo play and you're not really like relying on your team and you're playing alone, you have to use peeking to your advantage. Now, there's a lot of different guides into peeking that you can look into. I know Compicky, a good Radiant coach that I know, has recently posted a guide that you guys can look at. I'm pretty sure you guys can Google it and you guys can find it. But he basically covers a lot of the essentials. When you're taking fights, peeking is where it's at. In these 50-50s to get a first blood, it is about peeking. Okay? You can use different things to kind of give yourself an edge. So for example, you can use utility for that extra piece of advantage. So KG over here can use a turret to maybe get any advantage when they swing, or maybe Jack can use the smoke to create a one-way here and then they can swing. They can give themselves small advantages, sure, but at the end of the day, when it comes down to the shot, it's still a 50-50. Now, with that in mind, we need to consider that not every single agent has the same tools. So, for example, a Viper could not swing this as effectively as the KJ. KJ has something that they can use here to kind of play this fight. Whereas the Jet, as opposed to somebody, I don't know, let's say, again, I'll just use Viper as an example. Okay. If we were to look at Viper as in this particular example, we would see that Viper does not really have a lot of tools in their way to be able to win this fight. So please consider the agent that you're playing with. Please consider the agent that you're going to be working with, because at the end of the day, when you're playing for these 50-50s, you have to also consider the previous rounds, right? Think about the context of the previous rounds. Have they swung this before? What are they doing? Do you have like an advantage? Is it things like, for example, are you just egoing, right? It's that whole ego versus strategy. Like, are you doing it for a strategic reason, or you're just doing it just because you can, right? Make sure you're paying attention to how you're trying to get this advantage. Pay attention to your agent. Not all agents are perfect for this. Those that can get away quickly tend to be more advantageous in that. So if you're a duelist player, congratulations, you have the biggest advantage when it comes to getting these first bloods, but by no means are you the only one. But that same thing, again, watch out for the ego. There's a lot of times where you can encounter this first point of contact and it might not just go your way. Second thing, let's talk about the different advantages, the attacker side advantages, and then we'll move on to the defender side advantages. I know a lot of people tend to use Overwhelm, Divide, and Conquer as a form of the same strat. These are 3 different strats that we will cover that attackers can use to try to gain an advantage on a man advantage, right? So we've talked about how they get to destabilize the enemy team just simply by getting that pick. Well, by these strategies, in an attempt to get the enemy team, maybe just getting a player, they can still gain the advantage of space. And then this is what I was talking about, that ego versus space thing. Are you just trying to do it for like just your ego, or are you just trying to do it to gain space? So let's look at the first strategy, and that's to overwhelm. Overwhelming strategies are pretty good, just simply because you know that there's a player that might swing. So let's say in this scenario right here, let's say your team is aware that this race has been peaking every single time. Okay, your KJ has been playing back. They always like to get swung. KJ has been losing the fights, but they know that this player likes to swing. They like to take this space. They like to verify that this space is a thing. So what you might do is you might go for an overwhelm strategy. And these are pretty common when it comes to looking at aggressive plays. You can look at, for example, using a pop flash, using flashes, using double swings, playing a point of contact. Rain is going to swing, and then I'm going to swing. Using plays like this, where you can use a player swinging, a player flashing, and then maybe someone double satcheling in. Rest in peace. I did hear about the changes on Rays. But there's a lot of things like that that might potentially happen that you can use to overwhelm an opponent. And this is what the overwhelm strategy is about. Okay, using any form of utility that you can to catch that opponent. Now you can say there are some things that you can do on defense, and we'll get on that in just a second. But generally, you're trying to get that opponent on their own. The second one is to divide. Okay, the divide strategy is a little bit more difficult to pull off, but they do exist. Basically, the way that it works is based on previous rounds, based on previous setups that you've seen the enemy do. Okay, you can essentially use divide-based strategies, and I decided to use this little strategy over here from the defender side onto the attacker to kind of just visualize it a little bit better. But these plays happen on attack. I just wanted to just make it easier for you guys to understand. But the way that divide works is for you guys to essentially separate opponents on one end and then be able to isolate an opponent on the other. So this is one example where we might be able to see, 3 opponents over here are just going to basically isolating this brim off of one side. If we were looking at this position right here, you can say, yeah, this is one example of them also dividing the Rays away from their team. They might do something like using a Viper that cuts up this space and then just leaving this opponent on their own, right? They might use nades and then potentially cut off this area over here so the Rays has nowhere to go. Just looking at these positions allows you to separate opponents and gain an advantage based on, what teammates are on the field and what you're trying to really accomplish. Again, divide strategy is a little bit harder to accomplish, but they are still viable when it comes to getting that first blood. Okay, last but not least is the conquer strategy. Conquering space is something that's really popular, especially when you're playing in a ranked game and you know that you have an ult. These are really easy to pull off. Conquer strategies are pretty much just, let's just take this space by force. And if the enemy doesn't respect it, we're going to get a numbers advantage. Okay, this is one really easy way for you to get a first blood. Things can go wrong if things are not properly sequenced. So let's say, for example, this guy throws the smoke and then fails to throw the flash to kind of follow that up, or throws the flash a little too early and they don't really get anything out of it. Or this guy throws the ult when nobody is ready to go and they haven't really cleared out trips, right? Be very aware of the conquer strategy as it can very easily fall back onto you. But again, it's a really good way for you guys to pressure space. And if they don't respect it, you get a man. Okay, easy peasy. Any questions in regards to the attacker sided plays? No questions? Okay. Perfect. Let's talk about defender strategies. Okay. So defender strategies are a little bit easier. Okay. These are the ones that most players tend to rely on when it comes down to getting a player. These are pretty much the easiest ones to kind of just work on, since attacker sided, there's a lot of pressure from a lot of different things, but defender side is perhaps the easiest one to get like a first blood in. And using that same idea, that first point of contact, using that same idea, we can look at 3 different strategies. The first one is lane priority. Okay. When you're looking at an advantage, lane priority is a little bit harder to do with the utility that you have on attacker side. Okay. You do not have the choke advantage, whereas the defenders do. So one example is over here on Lotus, A side, you can see that they have this choke as an advantage. Whereas if you're an attacker, sure, you could send out a lot of utility and try to do the conquer strategy. But these guys have an easier time locking down a lane simply because of the map advantage. Okay. And that's what defenders have. They have a huge map advantage. They have a huge angle advantage that we'll cover in just a second. But they just essentially have a way for them to be able to lock down areas just a lot easier without the use of ultimates and anything of the like. Okay. It is very similar to the conquer strategy, as in it is a full aggressive push to lock down a lane. And it has the same idea of, if they don't respect the space, or if we take the space and they don't really do anything about it, we can get a first blood out of it, right? So all of these strategies have been revolving around getting the space and catching the opponent off guard quickly, right? These are all pretty much really useful ways of getting a first blood. The second one is passive angles. Okay. Very similarly to how I talked about the divide strategy that, you could use it on attack. Passive angles are something that you can also use on attack, but they work and they favor the defender side a little bit easier. Okay. Passive angles, you can see them a lot of the time with contact plays or one and dones. And what you can do is you can always try to pay attention to what angles are being covered and which are not. Okay. An attacker's side, like an attacker, could very easily just hold this angle right here and just wait for the Viper to rotate off and just use this lurk as an advantage, right? We've covered lurking in the past. We've covered how there's different types of lurking. There's passive, there's aggressive types of lurks, and you can use them to find the pick. Well, by just holding an angle alone, you can use that and gain a pick and get that advantage. When we're looking at passive angles for the defenders, though, to get that first blood, we can look at how they can use contact plays. Again, using those chokes, using that map advantage, and potentially catch opponents off guard. So this is one example that we have right here. Let's say, for example, we're down on money. We can kind of give this Jett, maybe, for example, a Judge, Bucky, anything, and we can lock down this lane right here with the intention of catching them off guard. Maybe we've already cleared a lot of utility. We've cleared out the drone. We're just waiting for a dart to come out. That's fine. Viper will get it. We can hold this cross right here. Right. And you can use these passive angles with the intention of playing crosses and trying to build some sort of momentum by catching them off guard. And again, if they mess up and they push one player in and they don't really make it, you have that advantage. Whether it's momentary or whether it's for the whole round, you have that advantage. And that's the importance of using passive angles. Passive angles do not have to be with a teammate. They're recommended that you do them with a teammate, but if you're just a solo player and you're not having any luck, there's a lot of different places. So for example, maybe you're Omen UTP onto Wine on Ascent. You can use that as a way of maybe for example, clearing an entire team if they don't look at you, or you can catch maybe there's Sentinel in the back, right? You can look at different ways of playing these advantages as long as you're paying attention to what the context of that round was. If they haven't cleared Wine once in their life, then you can use that as a one and done and you can get that advantage. If no one has cleared this right side, you might be able to hide there as maybe Neon is going to be getting a buff. She throws a fast lane and she runs right into B side. You can contain yourself in this position and maybe catch the rest of the team as they go in, right? First bloods can lead from having an advantage at the beginning of the round to somewhere in the middle of the fight. Okay, make sure you're looking at those passive angles very thoroughly, as there's a lot of chances that these off angles might catch players off guard and give you a very big disadvantage right at the beginning of the fight. And now the last one. Okay, the last one is where most of the first bloods tend to happen. And I'm just going to cover this one in two ways. So the first one is looking at it in the economic side of things. Okay, we already know that defenders have really long spaces that they just can completely hold. And the biggest example of it is using the op. We know that the op is mostly defender-sided. This is not like CS2 where you can just use the op on either side. It has a very big advantage, right, on the defender side. It is really slow. It's very clunky sometimes if you're trying to navigate it in the attacker side, but in the defender side, it's really easy to just hold this angle and try to catch someone off guard, right? So when we're looking at these angle advantages, we can see that having an economic advantage allows you to look for first bloods. And again, these first points of contact, right? These are really big hotspots. This little choke right here, this little entrance, right? You can look at these hotspots. You can look at these first points of contact to find that angle advantage. And you can either use economic advantages or you can use the purpose of the angle advantage. So using this area over here, we can see that if we were to look at KJ versus Jett, Jett has the advantage of using peeker's advantage. They get the peek, they get that advantage to themselves. They can use that to catch the opponent off guard and potentially use that little bit of that server leeway to maybe get the pick on the opponent. Whereas the angle advantage that KJ provides is a lot more reserved to how good the reaction time is, to how good their crosshair placement is. Perhaps the Jett has never swung this, and they can use this to push up and play contact with the turret. And then that way they can catch an opponent off guard, right? Using these things is pretty good since most of the time defenders have a bigger edge when it comes to looking for these fights. Generally, more often than not, they have more information. For example, KJ can stay looking at this angle and they'll know if a Jett has swung or not. and then they can choose whether they're going to participate in that fight or not, right? They get that choice of whether they're going to play that angle or not, and that's the angle advantage that they have. It's an inherent position just because, it's an inherent advantage because of the position that they get and the amount of information they get from it, okay? So looking at it, we have 3 different strategies on all sides, and again, it is important for you guys to look at each individual one carefully and to kind of assess what utility you guys have in the first place. Okay, the one that you guys will always find yourself in is just those 50-50s. Don't overcomplicate it. Look at those on angles. Look at those positions where the player tends to play the most and just play around those areas. Most of the time, you don't really need more than just a flash to really contest these advantages right here. But at the end of the day, it's one of those things where you have to completely respect the fact that they have that advantage. Okay. So with that out of the way, today's class was a little bit quicker, like I mentioned. Does anyone have any questions? This is a good place for you guys to ask questions. This is a great place for us to develop a little bit more into it. Again, it's about creating space. It's about getting that information. It's about getting that first blood to create gaps in an enemy's default or anything of the sort. Does anyone have any questions? No questions? Perfect. Okay. We will be moving in from the class, and now we will be starting with the script. Let me close the class.